This is part 2 of a discussion between myself and ChatGPT as we think through and expand on grace, faith, the law, once saved, always saved, and the atonement. The thoughts and prompts are mine, derived from listening to Christian teachers such as Winky Pratney, Gordon Olson, Harry Kahn, and Francis Schaeffer. I'll start off the discussion and we'll see how Chat responds and explains my thoughts in a coherent manner. At times it's a little redundant, but that is good. These subjects can be confusing, and repeating things helps us to get the gist of the concepts.
Okay, let's get into the discussion.
Okay, I definitely want to translate my idea into a short, clear explanation that I can use in a talk or video, since the concept of ultimate intention versus descriptive law is something most people have never heard articulated explicitly. I also want to explore or articulate the idea that even though we are now under grace, the law is still mandatory. Grace does not remove the law. Once you become a Christian and your ultimate intention is changed, you still have to obey the law. Do you have to obey the law perfectly in order to stay in a relationship with Jesus? Maybe yes, maybe no, but for the sake of this discussion, let's say maybe not. Maybe you do not have to obey it perfectly, but the requirement is still there. The requirements are accurate descriptions of how we should behave. Because of that, that description is never going to go away, and the requirement to live that way never ceases. The function the law now has in a believer's life is this. When you realize that you are outside of how you are supposed to live, or to put it another way, when the law tells you, hey, you are not living the way you're supposed to be living, it becomes a teaching tool. It makes you stop and say, wait a minute, that does not line up with my ultimate intention. I really want to love God and my neighbor, but now I am breaking the law. At that point, you recognize, I am wrong. I should not do that. And that is correct. You should not do that. You should stop. Grace is not going to say that now that you realize you have broken the law, it suddenly does not matter. It does matter. You do have to stop, because that is how you end up loving God and your neighbor, by stopping whatever is wrong and then doing what is right. So I would also like to throw that into the mix.
What you are circling around is a change in the role of the law, not a cancellation of the law. The same moral content remains, but its place in the moral system changes. If you explain that clearly, most of the confusion around law versus grace disappears. Let me first shape the idea into a clear explanation you could use in a talk or video. Then I will expand the logic underneath it. A clear explanation you could present. When people hear that Christians are not under the law but under grace, many assume that the law no longer matters. But that is not what actually changes. The law still describes what a life of love for God and neighbor looks like. Murder, theft, lying, and exploitation are still wrong. Faithfulness, honesty, mercy, and justice are still right. The moral standard itself does not disappear. What changes is the role the law plays in your life. Under the law itself becomes the reason you obey. You obey because the rule is there and it carries rewards and penalties. The motivation is external. The law stands over you as the authority that drives your behavior. Under grace, something deeper changes. Your ultimate intention shifts. Instead of living primarily to satisfy a rule system, you begin living for God Himself. The center of motivation moves from the rule to the relationship. But the law does not vanish. It now functions differently. It becomes the description of what a life that loves God and neighbor actually looks like. So the law is no longer the engine that drives obedience. It becomes the map that shows you whether your life is aligned with your intention. This also means the law still has an important role. When your behavior contradicts the law exposes that contradiction. It shows you that your actions are no longer lining up with your intention to love God and neighbor. At that moment, the law functions as a teacher. It tells you that something in your life needs to change. Grace does not say that the violation suddenly stops mattering. Grace does not say that wrongdoing is acceptable. Instead, grace restores the relationship and calls you back to the life that actually reflects love for God and others. So the law is still mandatory in the sense that it still defines what is right and wrong. What changes is that it is no longer the basis of the relationship, but it remains the standard that describes how that relationship should be lived out. The logical structure behind your idea. Your framework really has 3 layers. The moral standard does not change. The law continues to describe the structure of moral reality. Love for neighbor still excludes murder, theft, deception, and exploitation. Love still requires honesty, faithfulness, and justice. These are not temporary rules. They are descriptions of what love actually looks like in action. So the law remains normative. The motivational center changes. Under law, behavior is primarily regulated by external authority. The motivation is to avoid punishment, obtain reward, and satisfy the rule. Under grace, the motivational center becomes relational and intentional. The motivation becomes love for God, a desire to live rightly, and alignment with one's new intention. The law, therefore, stops functioning as the primary driver of behavior. The law becomes diagnostic and instructional. Once intention is oriented toward God, the law becomes a diagnostic instrument. It reveals when your behavior contradicts the life you claim to be pursuing. So the law functions as a mirror that exposes moral failure, a guide that shows the right direction, and a teacher that corrects behavior. But it is no longer the legal mechanism that sustains the relationship. The key tension you raised: must the law be obeyed perfectly? You already sensed the tension correctly. The standard itself does not relax. The law still describes what perfect love would look like, but the relationship with Christ is not sustained by flawless performance of that standard. If it were, the system would collapse back into pure law. Instead, the law remains the true description of righteousness, while grace provides restoration and correction when the standard is violated. That is why, in many theological explanations, the law continues to function as a corrective teacher rather than the basis of acceptance. So in the framework you are describing, the law still defines what is right. Violations still matter. Repentance and correction are required. But the relationship itself is not maintained by perfect legal compliance. Why your ultimate intention concept is powerful. Your insight about ultimate intention solves a problem that people often miss. It explains how the same commandments can exist in both systems while operating differently. The law has not changed. What has changed is the reason you obey it and the role it plays in your life. Under law, the rule produces the behavior. Under grace, the relationship produces the behavior, and the rule describes what that behavior should look like. If you want, the next step would be extremely useful for your broader project. We could also connect this framework to Paul's argument in Romans 7-8 and Galatians, because Paul actually describes the law in a way that fits surprisingly well with the structure you are articulating.